This is really sort of a two-part opportunity. One, to let folks know what we've been up to in terms of our CTE research, but also a direct follow-up to our first ever conference that we had last month. We heard pretty overwhelmingly from folks that they wanted to know what our research was about. We opted to keep it a secret at that time so we could focus more on some of our programmatic outcomes, not necessarily the research itself. So this is an opportunity to do a deep dive into that. And you all are very fortunate because we just completed what we believe is our clearest and most in-depth research to date on career and tech ed in rural districts. So we've been doing this for a couple years now, but this offers a more complete picture of what we're seeing. And to spoil the ending for you, what we learned is that rural schools are doing career tech ed, but they're really struggling to grow it, right? In all the ways that not only that their students need, but our current and future economy needs as well. So with that, I will give us an overview of what we are going to talk about today. So I'm going to do a brief intro to AIRS and the CT project, just in case you haven't encountered us in the past. But then I'll spend quite a bit of time talking about our survey. That really is the meat of some of the research that we've had continually going for 3 years now. And so that's really what's guiding a lot of our work as of late. I'll offer an analysis of this, and I think importantly, I want to talk about some of our actions that we've been up to as well, just to show that this isn't just about, what can we get in a survey to put on paper, but it's really about what can we get from a survey on paper to then do for your districts out there. And then lastly, I'll open it up for discussion, any questions that folks have. So get us started off, just in case you haven't had the chance to work with AIRS, the Association of Illinois Rural and Small Schools in the past, this is briefly who we are. So since 1987, we have remained the only organization in the state of Illinois to specifically serve as the voice of rural and small schools. Now, most folks may not realize how prevalent rural districts are in the state, but I love maps. You're going to see at least a couple today. This map depicts all of our rural and small districts in the state of Illinois. There are 491 of them, and as of yesterday, we now have an official state definition that recognizes that 57% of our districts are rural and small town school districts. Now, of those 491, 271 that we classify as high need, and that is a federal designation that I'll talk about a little bit in a bit as well. Really, a lot of our work is trying to counter that common narrative out there that is really trying to say that rural schools either don't matter or that they just don't exist, right? Or that the issues they have are outweighed by just a larger issue elsewhere, right? When in reality, a lot of the issues that our rural and small town schools face are shared with some of our inner city, larger urban districts as well, right? But because the narratives tend to be smaller, because our population sizes are smaller, it's easier to marginalize those perspectives, right? And so our work is to demarginalize them, right? Bring them in the spotlight to say, hey, when we can address all schools, then all students in our state have a brighter future together. The starting point for all this has been data and definitions. You'll see that as a theme throughout all of this. And really, in my understanding, the core purpose as to why is this sort of pseudo formula at the bottom, right? That a strong school in a rural area will not only lead to empowered students, but sustained communities as well. And that's what it's really about. It's about obviously strengthening the school itself, providing world-class education, but it's about student empowerment because empowered students then become empowered citizens, right? That then reproduce our communities that we call home. So that's briefly what we're about and sort of the flavor of the work we do. The Rural Career Tech Ed project is sort of one great articulation of this, I think. It's been a partnership that we've had with ISB for 3 years now to review the resource needs and equity gaps of CT programs in all 491 rural districts. Now, I know some might say, oh, you're doing this with ISB, therefore there's this sort of auditory, sort of like, sort of concerning aspect to it. But really, it's kind of the opposite of that, right? We're not trying to come in to say, hey, you're doing this wrong. Rather, we're coming in to say, hey, tell us what you're doing, right? Are you proud of? What works? What doesn't work, right? How can we work with you to help? So really, it's a unique chance for you as rural districts to voice your needs, your challenges, and your successes because there's really two objectives for this work. Obviously, there's the research, so the what's going on, but importantly, there's the technical assistance, the local assistance, right? The what do we do about it? And I know I'm speaking for myself, but I think our larger team as well, that's what we really love doing the most, right? Obviously hearing from you, but then also seeing how we can help you as well. So that's a little bit about the CT project and AIRS. If you have any questions, be sure to put them in the chat, and we can also come back to them at the end. So let's dive into the survey itself. This is an overview of what the survey has collected over its 3 years, but it's really reflecting the most recent iteration of it. There have been 3 rounds of it, as I've been saying. 2024 to 2025 was the baseline. Prior to this effort in those years, there had been no attempts in the state to aggregate rural data specifically from the overall state data sets on career and technical education. So we, with ISB, set out to do it. Those first 2 rounds were really high level. They gave us a really good indication of generally where schools were at, right? But it didn't really give us clarity and it didn't give us depth, right? It gave us a direction of where we should go next. And so the primary goal of the most recent survey that you're hearing the results from today were specifically that depth and clarity, more granular data, and offering more explanations on some of the trends that we saw. So this map shows who responded to this most recent survey. As you're going to see in our next slide, it's really representative of the whole state, right? There aren't too many pockets that don't have a rural district that we didn't hear from. I would say Lake County is probably the one. Interestingly enough, Lake County does have 2 districts that we code as rural. So that would be probably the one county that is left out that you may not realize has a rural district in it. So who have we been talking to, right? Obviously rural districts, but specifically what we mean by that is this NCES 30 and 40. I could go in long time talking about this, but basically 30s are your small towns and 40s are your country schools, broadly speaking. So we're talking to small towns and country schools. Now, as I said, we have a certain flag for high need, and this is what we call the REAP eligibility, right? REAP is a federal assistance program for schools that are small enough and remote enough, or that are rural and have a high poverty rate among their students. Both of those will flag you as REAP eligible. And so, in our minds, that is a trustworthy sort of classification for a district being higher need than maybe some other rural districts. So these are sort of the 2 populations that we've been looking at for our data. Just like with the overall project, what is it that we're seeking to learn here? What is it we're seeking to do? Ultimately, it's equity, right? And equity in this context is a combination of access and adequacy, right? Do your students have access to the programming they need? And is that access adequate, right? Does it actually provide them a robust step out of school and into whatever post-secondary looks like? And so within there, what programs are you doing? Where are you offering them? And what challenges exist as well? And how we did this, obviously, we're talking about the surveys, but I do want to give a shout out that we also do focus groups and site visits and interviews as well. So most of the perspectives that we will share in the analysis portion come from the survey, but our focus groups and site visits are extremely informative to dive deeper into some of these topics as well. And it's helped us shape sort of what we think about the data and also what we've been doing with it out in the field. So with the overview, let's dive into some of the specifics. So starting with the demographics. Like I said, we were truly representative of the whole state. One thing I'll say off the bat, there's a lot of different pies with a lot of different slices in here. I think the most important point to take from this is these proportions are the same if you were to take the whole slate of rural schools, right? We had a 73% response rate, and of our response rate, these are all proportionate to rural schools overall. So we were representative. That does represent 91% of Illinois counties, and it is an increase from our first 2 rounds of surveys. So in total, we had 274 responses from 258 districts. For those districts where we had multiples, we just kept the most recent response that we had had from that district. As you see here, we did engage all 6 geographic regions of the state as defined by the State Association for Regional Offices of Education. And our East Central, West Central, and Southeast are our most prominently rural parts of the state. So Northwest is a little bit outsized here, but we still did get representation from them as well. In terms of those 30s, 40s, those towns and country schools, right? Again, we have representation from all six of them in here, and this 42, so your rural distant, is the most common type of district in the state, actually, but especially among rural districts. So, once again, representative. One thing I will say, unlike our previous survey, we had a lot more small towns respond. Now, small town districts in this context kind of go two ways, right? You might think that they are larger, so they might be able to support more CTE and they might have more resources and access. That is true in some instances. It's also the case that some of our remote towns, so our 33s and some 32s, actually have a harder time finding resources, right? Because they are an island in and of themselves, but they don't have a lot of opportunity to reach out to grow programming. So I do think some of the data reflects the fact that we had more resourced districts respond, as well as some districts that have some pretty severe needs despite having a larger population. All in all, we had a lot of unit districts respond. That's on trend with sort of the breakdown in the state. I do want to make a point that I did reach out to all of our elementary districts as well, because I know that even though they don't offer career tech ed, I wanted them to say that, right? Like I wanted the data point that said, oh, hey, we teach K-8 and we don't offer CTE because of X reasons. Not all of them responded, so just to make sure the data wasn't too skewed, I did scrub the elementary district data from the charts you're going to see here, but we do have it kept in our data banks, and we use it and we reach out to our elementary districts frequently to talk about it. And then lastly, there is your REAP eligibility. I would say this is the one major departure from our earlier survey. So our earlier surveys specifically sought out the high need districts. Again, this survey was to everybody, so we had a higher percentage of districts that don't receive this additional federal assistance than is necessarily true overall. So again, our data might reflect slightly larger, slightly better resourced districts. So that's who we talked to. Let's get into what they actually told us. And in my opinion, this is probably the biggest piece to take home. What are our rural schools actually doing, right? We, in previous years, used the old ISB framework for breaking down career tech ed. ISB at that time identified seven different clusters, as they're known, in the career tech ed space. The problem with that is that didn't match either the pre-existing federal framework for career tech ed or the new framework for career tech ed. And so we really had no way of telling what rural schools actually offered, right? We also didn't ask where they offered their classes. So districts before simply got a list of seven choices and the question, do you offer it, right? So there were clear limitations with that. So this was the biggest piece that I was hoping to get to, to ask in more detail across the 16 new clusters and where they were offering it. So we have the career sectors that the most recent national CT framework discusses, and we have six common areas where CT is offered. So obviously in district, but in another district as well, at a career center, in your community college, through an education for employment system, an EFE system, or at a four-year college and university. What we found is that 99.6 of rural schools offer CTE who responded, right? There was a single district who said they do nothing, which I think is pretty good. That means that our schools are doing something, right? Um, but what I think is important for us to keep in mind now and moving through our future slides is really looking at this in-district color, right? For reasons that I'm sure some of you know, but if you're sort of new to the rural space, is going to be incredibly important moving forward, is it takes quite a bit of resources and time to travel, right? If you don't have something at your district to do literally anything else. And so while in theory, some of these clusters are pretty robustly offered through like a career center or community college, in practice, that doesn't mean students can actually use it, right? And so what's going to be important for us to keep in mind is this lighter teal color. Are you offering it in district? What we can say so far is we see some larger percentages in certain clusters. So ag, I don't think surprises anybody, is pretty prominent in our rural districts. Same too for business and finance. Career exploration is pretty high. healthcare and human services, and skilled trades. You get the construction in there. Those would kind of be your top five, right? But when you look in the detail of where these are offered, you see a different story. Obviously, we're doing ag at home, we're doing business at home, but our healthcare largely is not at your home district, right? If we do anything with healthcare, you're going out. Or it may be virtual, even, right? That technically we don't offer it at our school, but we do some sort of virtual program. Now, the reason I say this is there's sort of a misalignment between what we're seeing in this chart and what our rural economy is now and will be moving into the future. And so this is an additional piece of data outside of the survey that I wanted to bring in to demonstrate this point. So we took the Illinois Department of Employment Security's labor market projections for 2022 to 2032, and we coded every single workforce innovation region in Illinois, all of their occupations by the 16 career clusters, just to see what is the average growth rate per region, per cluster across the board, right? And what we found is in terms of growing sectors, every single region of the state is growing in digital technology, projected over the next 10 years, right? Ag is pretty strong. It's not even growth. Healthcare and human services very strong, also seeing growth in every sector. Same too for hospitality, and then energy and supply chain growing overall, different per region, right? But when we look at what our schools are actually preparing our students for into the future, it's kind of a different story, right? Obviously, we have ag covered, but healthcare is only fourth on here, right? Digital tech, you're getting lower. And then some of these more, I might say concrete sectors, like we can picture in mind, what a health or what a hospitality facility looks like, right? What an energy facility looks like. We're hardly training our students at all, right? It's rather concerning. When you look at the overall average of in-district offerings for CTE, we're only about 39% in rural areas because some of these, high demand clusters are so rarely offered at home. Now, this is the future, right? This kind of confusing color-coded spreadsheet and these bars are talking about what comes next. But what about right now, right? Well, what we know for our largest employment sectors in rural districts now is healthcare, it's education, it's small mom and pop businesses, right? So obviously it's business, but that's also entrepreneurship, and it's government. Government services actually occupy a pretty large portion of rural economies across the state of Illinois. And again, I turn us to our overall chart here. What are we doing to prepare our students for that, right? None of those, other than healthcare, are in the top five at all. I think education alone should be sort of sobering. I mean, that's totally in our control to do. You don't have to have a special facility for it, right? We're already at school. And yet, barely 30% of rural districts are doing anything to inspire their students to replace them when the teachers retire, right? So what I want to say about this is we got clear, good data on what schools are doing and where they're offering it. And I think there's a very cautious tale to tell here that even though we may claim, oh, hey, almost 100% of rural schools offer career tech ed, well, what are they offering? Is it aligned with current and future economies? And do students actually have access to it, right? And the answer to that is a lot more complicated. Probably not. A lot of districts don't have in-district access, and it's not quite aligned with our future economy. So those are course offerings. Something else that's incredibly important for career tech ed, as we all know, is work-based learning or the opportunity to do something hands-on with an employer somewhere, right? Our earlier survey only asked teachers if they felt sort of the personal capacity to offer work-based learning. We didn't ask for types of work-based learning. We didn't ask for any sort of elaboration. Just, do you feel confident to do it, right? And even at that sort of vague question, only 51% of teachers felt they had high to very high capacity to offer work-based learning, which is somewhat problematic, right? Like that's the whole point of career tech ed, not just to be butts and seats to learn something, but it's to get your hands on to do something, right? And then to apply that in a career somewhere. So we knew that just behind a more detailed look at program offerings was a more detailed look at work-based learning. And so when we asked that, we tried to divide what we felt were the most common types of work-based learning, and this is what we found. that similar to course offerings, 96.5% of rural schools are doing something for work-based learning, right? So most of all rural students are getting some experience somehow. But again, there's a very clear divide between what schools are doing now, have the capacity to do, and maybe what might set students best up for the future, right? And really, this divide, in sort of my mind, comes between, what is pretty deployable now for a district versus what takes some more concerted effort, but is higher value and higher impact in the long run, right? So we're really good at field trips. We're really good at career fairs. And I think those are great entry points, right? Like those are going to do wonders for exposure. Same too for job shadowing, right? You're going to really get an even more in-depth look at, okay, here's what's going on. But what about actually getting your hands on, right? Internships, mentorships, apprenticeships, pre-apprenticeships, um, not quite as commonly offered in our rural districts. So our districts are exposing students to what could be out there, but we're not quite doing the next step of putting students in those positions, right? Multiple reasons for why. Again, as I sort of led into, there's a lot more coordination and effort that it takes to do these. And not that our rural districts don't want to do them, but our rural districts are pretty taxed, right? There's a lot that our administrators and educators and even students already have to do to think about orchestrating a regional apprenticeship program and everything that's entailed is quite a bit. Um, I had the opportunity back in December actually to present an early form of this data to a national audience at the ACTE conference. And I got a very great question thrown at me, which was, well, isn't that what your districts have work-based learning coordinators for? You know? And, my blunt but truthful statement was, what coordinators, right? Our districts don't often have these positions, right? Or if our district has a WBL coordinator, it's a 16th time of a counselor who's already overloaded trying to, offer services to an entire high school, right? So the fact of the matter is it's not for lack of trying on rural schools' efforts. I think I want to make that pretty clear in all of this. It really goes to show just how stretched thin our resources are that we're still able to do something, even if it isn't maybe the fullest expression that it could be. Um, I think the only other point to say here is, again, this earlier survey we asked more vaguely about, what capacity do you feel to do work-based learning, right? And for some of these more intensive options, our educators themselves really only felt about 27% high to very high confidence in their capacity to offer them, right? So there might even be a story about intentional professional development that we might look into as well. So program offerings, work-based learning. Why is it important to talk about what our districts can do? And it comes back to this idea of school partnerships, right? And we're starting to dive into this transportation piece a bit. I hope we know that for many types of complex programs, it's pretty impossible for a district in a rural area to do it alone. You might be able to, and you might be able to do one thing very well on your own. But for the large ecosystem of partners and programs that it takes to do 21st century career tech ed, you have to work with others, right? And so I wanted to ask the question, are you working with other school districts first, right? Like, let's forget if you can even find a workforce partner. Are you working with your neighboring district down the road to pool students, to pool resources, just to meet student and community need? And by and large, the answer is no. Just barely over 50% of districts aren't working with a fellow school district. And I think, again, it's telling on those program offerings that, you know, some were offered in another district, but really there was a few that were offered at home and a lot that were just sort of hoping another partner picks up, right? This is additionally salient because this map tracks which of our rural districts have access to a career center. Career centers, hugely important. They're very great resources if you have access to one, right? And just by colors alone, not even half of rural districts are listed on a career center website, right? And going to this piece of transportation, even if you're listed on a career center's website, it might still be a 30 to 45-minute one-way commute for a student, right? That becomes a massive issue. So functionally, there's even less than that 50% of rural districts that have access to a career center. Um, so we're starting to get an even clearer picture. We have some offerings, may not be aligned with our economy, but we're doing our best. We're doing some work-based learning. It's very introductory, it's exploratory, it's exposing. But again, the higher quality, like hands-on aligned aspects we're struggling with, and we're not really reaching out to others, right? For a variety of reasons, to collaborate and to offer more complex programming. And so to put a bow on it, we did ask about transportation. It's perennially an issue in rural districts, and so I simply wanted to ask, how are your students getting to CT courses and work-based learning outside of their home district, right? And by and large, students have to do it themselves. About 50% of districts will offer buses if it's a course, maybe 30% if it's work-based learning, right? But you're almost entirely reliant on students driving themselves. Um, in terms of cost saving, it makes some sense, right? Like a district can't afford to bus every kid everywhere in a rural area, but it does bring in a huge equity issue, right? Like, what if a parent doesn't want their student driving for that much amount of time, right? Or we even heard from one district in the southern part of the state that because students are expected to drive themselves, our poorest students just opt not to do CTE at all because they can't afford to drive or to give up an existing part-time job, which brings in money for their entire family in order to do something like this, right? So the fact that our rural districts have to rely so heavily on personal transport is a real barrier that's limiting the growth of CTE among students in general. And again, not to mention the fact that there's just a massive amount of instructional time lost when you're trying to calculate in, a 30 to 45 minute one-way commute. Students very realistically have to sit down and decide, do I take two mandatory graduation requirement courses or one elective CTE because it's still considered an elective that is more aligned with what I want to do, but I have to have these others to graduate a class, right? I believe that's it that I have on the transportation front. I did I put in public transport on both of these, just I think just for a little bit of humor because there isn't really. Sometimes there's some community buses, but it's not, as far as I know, it's not something students or schools actively think about. And I was heartened to see that, at least in terms of work-based learning, some districts so that they have students that walk or bike. I think that's a healthy habit. If you're in a town and can do it, I think that's pretty cool for many reasons. But by and large, we're relying on our students to get the job done. Dual credit, another important piece of CTE. We hadn't asked about anything with it previously, so I wanted to just put out there what types of dual credit do you offer, right? The answers we got on this were rather complex. I did it as an open-ended question, just so schools could list out what they had. And so I got two pieces of information, right? I got the total number of dual credit courses they offered, and I also got the types of dual credit they offered. So, in order to present something that could be compared across the state, I disregarded the total number of dual credit courses and instead looked at types. What types of dual credit in total does a district offer, right? And in that way, I think we could get a pretty good picture of overall what are the types of dual credit that rural districts are doing. I think we know that dual credit is kind of notorious for being difficult for rural districts, but really any districts to get done for a ton of reasons we don't have time for today. But despite the challenges, again, 92% of rural districts offer something for dual credit, right? So there is some potential for hope there. The amounts of dual credit courses range anywhere from, one district had one course to one district had 50 courses, right? And the average is about 13 overall. With that, CTE was the most common type of dual credit that our rural districts offer, which I think is heartening for this work, right? It may be difficult, but when a rural district is doing something with a community college, more often than not, it is your CTE or your core content, right? Your English, your math, or your science. And again, just I love funny little quirks in data. I love that there's a physical education dual credit in there. I've heard from some people what that looks like. I still would like to actually see that in practice. And tell my teacher I'm going to go to community college to do my PE course, but I think that's another conversation for another time. And then lastly, this one I actually wanted to show year by year. We wanted to know about the challenges, right? In terms of planning for this work in the future, we needed to know what your common challenges were, right? Previously, I simply asked, here's a list, pick three of what your common challenges are. And I think to nobody's surprise, educator shortages was number one, followed by, not enough funding and our equipment or facilities not being sufficient. Interestingly, I bring this up every time. Transportation barely hit a quarter of responses, but I think in face of not having teachers or not having money to do CTE, it probably gets dropped down just a little bit. But our original survey really just asked schools to rank them, right? And so I wanted to come back a second time and get some more granular detail as to, well, what about them is challenging, right? And again, I wasn't expecting to be surprised, but I was expecting to get it on paper for the first time, because then that provides a starting point for conversation with the state, with legislators, with whomever about how we support our rural schools. And so for educators, we see that really the main issue is poor pay. There's also obviously issues with the quantity of educators, but really the quality as well. This is sort of a hidden crisis within the improving, I say in air quotes, teacher vacancies across the state, right? Is how are we actually filling the need for educators? Are they fully licensed and prepared? They're all good people, but are they qualified to do it, right? A lot of districts mentioned that the isolation of their district makes it very difficult for educators to want to stay there. And then there's a lot of issues with getting the license for a CTE educator in the first place. All those sort of contribute there. In terms of facilities, once again, funding was the root issue. Not enough funding obviously impacts educators, impacts facilities as well. Of our existing facilities, our spaces are simply not enough. I have been to some schools where, a single classroom can get sort of partitioned three ways to do three types of courses, sometimes at the same time, sometimes at different times, right? So again, rural schools are being creative to meet the need, but there's still a great need out there to do even more. Obviously, distance issues, like I said, for any sort of, partnership, or we need to do something outside of what we do here, and our equipment is often outdated and very expensive to replace. Um, Funding, obviously, it's insufficient, but I was really struck by how many districts said that it's just unstable. And I think a lot of that comes down to the formulas that are used to calculate what your district gets, right? When you're working with such small student populations, the margin for error between having just enough to break even to I have not enough to do basic sort of coursework is very small. And so a lot of districts see pretty wide swings year to year in some of their CTE funding just because the student populations are so small and it can cause those formulae to fluctuate in erratic ways. So this was the crux of the survey. We wanted to know what you offered, what you were doing for work-based learning, and then some finer points around, well, what about dual credit, right? What about transportation? What about these challenges actually pose an issue for your district? And so with that, what exactly did we make of everything that we learned? In the past, we tried to do sort of policy recommendations or action steps, but I wanted to take a different route here and look more at themes, right? What was I hearing not only from the numbers that districts were saying, but the narrative optional questions as well. I always put three or four at the end that are entirely optional for districts to say anything they want about what they like, what they don't like. And so all of that was used to drive what we learned here. And first and foremost, most prominently, is that rural schools are enduring, right? They are very strong. They're trying to do everything they can. Yet there's a huge need out there for us to do more and to recognize the state of where things are, right? So we learned that we do know that rural districts are offering CTE, though it may not be in its fullest capacity. Because most districts are often in survival mode, right? Doing everything they can currently with what they have to serve students and communities. Again, using what they have at hand. But as we saw, it's not necessarily aligned either to student interest or community and economic need. We do have ag, we do have business. The arts were pretty high up in there as well, and family and consumer sciences were top offerings in district CTE at rural schools. But healthcare, education, and entrepreneurship are our economic drivers, right? Digital tech, energy, hospitality, and tourism are our future drivers. And we're really struggling to do either of those in our areas. Lastly, with sort of rural endurance and need, we realize that we kind of have poor collaboration, right? We don't have great transportation options, and there's low all-around capacity that's hindering the development of maybe a robust regionalist approach to CTE, right? So all that to say, rural schools are enduring, they're pretty tenacious, and there's still some pretty strong need that we see. Now, number two here is pretty controversial, but it's a tiny little hill that I don't know that I'll die on, but at least I'll yell at for a little bit, right? Or yell from for a little bit. And that is, I think there's actually a pretty big promise in dual credit that we may not always give enough attention to. Yes, there's huge issues with getting dual credit offered in a K-12 school district. But I think one thing that gives me hope is that every single school district is served by a community college, right? That's different than you can say of a career center. Not all schools can access a career center, but every school is within a community college district, right? So if for no other reason than to say 93% of our rural schools offer dual credit and every school is on the list for a community college to be served, that there might be promise there, right? To what does it look like to continue to invest in, a seamless dual credit process for our students and the doors that it might open in a time and place where it's expensive to grow career centers, expensive to grow, in-district offerings, right? There's a system out there that might offer us some support already, and that could be dual credit. Again, to nobody's surprise, but this is a hill that I will probably die standing on. Funding is the root issue, right? Simply put, we need more money for our rural districts, especially our tier one and tier two EBF districts. Um, Without that, there's a lot that we can do that you saw and that you're going to see here in a second, but there's even more that we're not doing and that we probably can't do, right? Um, so with that, I think it's important to know that what impressed heavily upon me is that in each of these analysis points in each of these issues, everything kind of points back to policy to me, and especially policy advocacy, right? That ultimately it's an issue of the local, state, and federal level not doing enough to recognize the challenges in rural districts to do this, right? There's good ideas for we got to do CTE and here's how you do it, but not enough follow up to say, oh, and for districts that have different capacities, different abilities, here's a little extra assistance to do it, right? Which that's what equity is. So there's not really rural equity in our policy. Again, it fails to specifically call out our rural districts. And when we do see policies that account for either rural schools or specific CTE clusters, then they do well, right? Again, I might get some flack for this, but I don't think it's surprising to me why ag and family consumer sciences is so heavily offered, right? Like ag is a major sector in our rural economies. It also has additional policy support around it and state support. Same for family consumer sciences, right? There's additional policy support for it. And so when policy is made, when legislators and us at the ground level act, things happen for the benefit in schools, right? I think the same could be done for funding, obviously, but for all CTE in general. And last, sort of another final point where I was really heartened is that there's immense pride in our rural schools. Again, I had a completely optional question to end it all up. What else do you want to say? I didn't bait the water with anything. I didn't say, tell me about X, Y, Z. Just what else do you want to say? And I was surprised and humbled at how many districts were deeply proud of their one course they offer, right? They recognize like, hey, we could be doing more, we need to do more. But the fact that we can get one part-time teacher for one course and that impacts, whatever percentage of our students, there's a lot of pride in that. And I think that pride speaks a lot of hope and potential for where rural CTE can go with even just a little bit more investment, right? Obviously, we need a lot, but even just a little bit more support would go a long way in a rural district to offering even more robust programming. So all of this has been what can we learn about it, right? What's going on? I want to actually close this out looking a little bit past that toward what do you do about it, right? I think this is sort of the other partner of research, which is action. So I learn something and I do something, right? And there's other times that we've spoke where we've gone into more detail on this, but I just want to give an initial take about what we're doing with this information in hopes that it might inspire you all to think about, well, maybe there's more that we can do, right? So I took the survey results, our other research, and our analysis and tried to synthesize it into a few core problems that are easy to address here and now, right? First and foremost is an overall lack of community identity, a lack of networking, a lack of awareness, not just in rural areas, but across the state, and really a lack of peer learning, right? We are aware that things are going on, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're all connected in a way that perpetuates innovation and new program growth in rural areas. So there's a need to foster togetherness, foster unity, right, so to speak. Number two, and I think I hit this on the head quite a bit, that there's a pretty clear misalignment between what our schools are doing and what the economy is and will be. There's not much more really to say there. And third is that persistent rural challenges are limiting our CTE growth. That's your transportation, that's your educators, your funding, your facilities, and it's even your dual credit issues, right? Um, all of that to get, and it's, like career centers not being able to reach every school, all of it together are persistent challenges that are limiting career tech ed in rural districts. So, what do we do about it? In our estimation, if we as heirs and as the rural ed community can offer an immediate direct assistance in these core areas, I think it'll go a long way to bolstering rural education, right? Like these three are huge. I don't think that we're going to be, prideful enough to say that we can solve them, but if we can offer some ground level, easy to implement, immediate actions to help even just a bit, that'll go a really long way. And so the goal for the solutions you're about to see really came back to this idea of how do we best build equity, understood as access and adequacy, right? Getting students in touch with good opportunities and making sure those opportunities are high quality, even if it's just a little glimpse. And so taking it all together, some solutions we thought of were quicker, low cost, high impact pilots, leveraging existing assets, and communications, advocacy, and networking. Each one of these, technical assistance, like I said, is one of the two purposes for the CTE project. And each one of these is trying to offer direct assistance to multiple areas of issue, right? They're not really one for one. Even that like lack of networking down to communications is trying to fire on multiple cylinders here. We're all trying to address the lack of teachers and networking, the lack of funds and space, misalignment, and labor markets all kind of together to offer a really punchy small action here. I also want to say that none of these are particularly difficult nor proprietary either, right? Again, I don't want to speak on behalf of my team for this, but at least for myself, I'm not a very smart man. I'm not a very capable man, right? So anything I can do that is something I can put into place is probably going to be something anyone with at least half a brain more than me can do, right? And do even better at that. And so some of these solutions, number one, obviously there's a direct one for one on communications here. At the end of the day, this is getting the word out, just building awareness and engagement, building local industry support. It's a direct answer to the lack of existing partnerships and engagement. So, in lieu of more partnerships, just trying to make folks more aware of each other's work is pretty good. And again, on the surveys themselves, we heard that teachers want to see more of what their peers are doing. They just don't always know how to do it. So we've offered some digital publications for us to do it, but also as a model for you all out there. In terms of misalignment, there's sort of two approaches we took here, right? The quicker, low cost, and the leveraging. For the quicker, low cost, or better, faster, stronger, if you want to think about it that way, really the idea is how do you offer an intensive, short experience in the field that is hybrid, allows you to do stuff at home, in school, but then also brings you into the field every now and again, but really is leveraging industry assets, right? What training systems do industry partners use? Are there any early licenses that 16-year-olds and up can apply for, right? So in a resource tight environment, finding these easy but impactful ways to add new skills and experiences is pretty critical, right? And if we can use the infrastructure that like healthcare is using or that a union is using, right, to train their new employees, then that is a pretty seamless way to get our students started as well. Because it minimizes sort of the resources that a school has to dedicate. It really just comes down to time, all while building partnerships. And then the second one here that we tried to um, bring into use for misalignment is leveraging existing assets. And really is just use the school, right? Use what you're already doing, just in maybe a different way. Not totally reinventing the wheel. I'm not foolish enough to think that every rural school could offer all 16 career clusters, but what would it look like to take an existing course and offer just a few more skills that are universally applicable, right? So, for instance, one thing you may have heard us talk about in the past is everybody offers ag in a rural district almost. So, what does it look like to have our ag courses, which are already more flexible, offer different skill sets like computer science, right? Computer science, digital tech, used in every single career sector, one of the growing industries, very hard for a rural district to do on its own. So, let's leverage an existing asset to do it as well. I think other good examples of this, our partners at Optera Energy Services and our partners at Train Incorporated also do really good work leveraging existing school infrastructure, right? To do data-informed work, engineering work. So all of that is about, what can we offer in terms of a pilot to take what you're doing at home and really grow on it and expand on it, right? So this is what we're doing. Our research, what did we learn? This is sort of our answer to it. What are you going to do about it, right? Obviously, there's more to say about it all, but I wanted to leave a little bit time at the end here to let you ask some questions, to think about what comes next, right? The project, I'm not going to say it's at a crossroads, but it's on its next step in the journey. We really have created the baseline understanding of what rural districts are doing, what their challenges are, and we've started to provide a roadmap for direct answers to help districts here and now that don't require a lot of resources, but it will still be very impactful for them, right? So, some things I'd like to hear, what else should we research? What else should we do? Or what other questions you have, right? So, I thank you guys for tuning on. I will open up any thoughts or questions people have. Yes, in the chat. Also feel free to reach out to me at john@airSSEDU.org. It's so important we get two hyperlink endings there, edu and .org. I always think that's pretty fun. But yes, we'll be, for those on the recording as well, feel free to reach out to me via email. I think I know most people, so folks probably know how to get a hold of me. I'll try and put myself out there. But yeah, I'm really curious to see, what you all think. I do take criticism decently well. So if you think this is a bunch of crock and I don't think that's right at all, I love that, right? Because I want to be right. So I want to try and make it more accurate to what you see going on in our school districts as well. So give a little bit more space for folks to think about it.
John, thanks for having us here. I'm with Karen. We're from One Goal and
Hmm.
just really appreciate all of this information. No questions right now, but you've given us a lot to think about.
Good deal. Thank you, Drew. Appreciate you folks being here. All right. Well, hearing none, seeing none, I will bring us to our last page here, which is a thank you. Really, I love public service. I love doing this for you all. I don't really care to gain much from it all other than knowledge and knowing that I can help, right? So thank you all for being here. Thank you to all the districts who have participated in this ongoing work, and for everybody who has supported and continues to work with the Association of Illinois Rural and Small Schools. This QR code will bring you to Rural CTE Project's web portal. So all of this research and more, all of our technical assistance and more, a handy dandy little helpline if you have questions for your district, as well as my email is listed here as well. So I do hope that folks will stay engaged with us as time goes on. If you happen to listen to this after the fact and have a question come up, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, that's all I got. So I appreciate folks tuning in. I will stick around after the recording stops for more questions and conversation if anyone has them.